Imagine a cavalry patrol moving slowly through the burning heat of the Texas desert in 1857. The sun is merciless. The men are exhausted. Their horses are struggling. Water is running low. The desert stretches endlessly in every direction: sand, rock, heat, silence. And then over the ridge, you see something impossible. Not horses, not mules, camels. Tall, swaying, long lashed, carrying heavy military equipment, moving steadily through terrain that would cripple a horse. And they're wearing U.S. Army gear. In one of the strangest chapters in American military history, the United States Army attempted to solve the problem of desert warfare by importing camels from the Middle East. As crazy as it sounds, this was not folklore. It was not a circus stunt. It was authorized by Congress, funded by taxpayers, planned by the Secretary of War, and carried out by the U.S. Army. This was the U.S. Camel Corps Experiment. Why did the United States believe camels might be the future of American expansion? Why did serious military planners consider this idea credible? Why did it nearly succeed? And what does this strange experiment reveal about American ambition and innovation in the years just before the American Civil War? Today, we enter the deserts of the 1850s to uncover a forgotten experiment that says far more about America than you might expect. This is the History Podcast. I'm Jason Thomason. Let's get started. To understand why camels entered the United States Army, we must begin not with animals, but with empire. By the 1850s, the United States was expanding at a staggering pace. The ideology of manifest destiny convinced many Americans that their nation was destined to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. A series of territorial acquisitions reshaped the map. The annexation of Texas in 1845, the Oregon Territory in 1846, and the vast lands taken from Mexico after the Mexican-American War in 1848. With the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the United States gained what would become California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and parts of New Mexico and Colorado. On paper, the expansion looked triumphant. But in reality, much of the new territory was harsh desert. The American Southwest presented enormous logistical challenges. Vast distances separated military posts. Reliable roads barely existed. And water sources, well, they were scattered and unpredictable. Summer temperatures in places like western Texas and southern New Mexico pushed both men and animals to their limits. The U.S. Army relied heavily on horses and mules, but these animals struggled in arid climates. Horses required frequent watering and could suffer heat exhaustion during long desert stretches. Military planners faced a practical question: how could the United States control territory that resisted traditional transportation? In the mid 19th century, Americans were deeply confident in their ability to solve problems through innovation. Industry was expanding, railroads were spreading east of the Mississippi, Technology seemed capable of conquering any obstacle. So, someone asked a question that sounded radical, but not unreasonable. If camels thrived in the deserts of North Africa and the Middle East, why not in Texas? The central political figure in this story is Jefferson Davis. Before becoming president of the Confederacy, Davis served as the Secretary of War under President Franklin Pierce from 1853 to 1857. Davis was deeply interested in military modernization. He supported new weaponry, improved infrastructure, and scientific experimentation within the Army. He also understood the logistical challenges of frontier warfare. The camel proposal had actually surfaced decades earlier, as early as the 1830s. Some Army officers stationed in Texas had suggested camels might be useful in desert regions. But earlier secretaries of war ignored the idea. Davis did not. He believed military policies should be guided by experimentation. If camels worked, the Army should use them. If they failed, well, the idea could be abandoned. In 1855, Congress appropriated $30,000 to test the concept, an amount worth nearly $1 million today. The mission would be carried out aboard a naval supply ship called the USS Supply. Responsibility for the mission fell to two officers, Major Henry C. Wayne of the Quartermaster Department and Lieutenant David Dixon Porter of the U.S. Navy. In 1855, the USS Supply crossed the Atlantic and entered the Mediterranean. Wayne and Porter traveled through the regions controlled by the Ottoman Empire, visiting locations such as Egypt, Tunis, and Smyrna. There, they encountered a culture where camels were not exotic animals, but essential tools of transportation. The Americans quickly realized that camels were not all the same. Wayne evaluated two types of camels: dromedaries, the single humped camels, adapted to hot desert climates and were capable of faster travel. But there were also the Bactrian camels, the larger double humped species known for carrying heavier loads. The Americans purchased 33 camels during their expedition, but the mission involved more than simply buying animals. The Army also had to hire experienced camel handlers, known as cameleers, from the Middle East to accompany the herd, simply because they had no idea what they were doing. Among them was a man named Haji Ali, later nicknamed Hi Jolly by Americans. The Army understood that importing camels without importing knowledge would be a catastrophe. Handling camels required skill, experience, and cultural familiarity. Transporting camels across the Atlantic posed its own challenges. The USS Supply had to be modified with special sling systems that allowed camels to be hoisted safely onto the ship. Once aboard, they were secured in specially constructed stalls. The animals endured the journey surprisingly well. And when the USS Supply arrived in Indianola, Texas in May of 1856, 34 camels had survived the voyage. One had even been born at sea. The herd was then marched inland to Camp Verde, about 60 miles northwest of San Antonio. Camp Verde would become the center of the American camel experiment. At Camp Verde, soldiers began learning how to work with camels. They practiced loading cargo saddles, mounting riding camels, and managing the animal's unusual behavior. Early reports were encouraging. Camels could carry enormous loads, sometimes up to 700 pounds. They traveled long distances with minimal water. They also fed on desert plants that, quite frankly, horses would not even think about touching. From a purely logistical perspective, camels appeared extremely promising. But problems quickly emerged. The first issue was simple: horses hated camels. The smell and appearance of camels caused cavalry horses to panic. This made it difficult for camel units to operate alongside traditional cavalry horses. The animals themselves also behaved differently than horses. Camels groaned loudly, spat when irritated, and could become aggressive if mishandled. They bit, they kicked sideways, and they sometimes just flat out refused to move. American soldiers trained in horsemanship found camel behavior unfamiliar and quite frustrating. Experienced cameleers understood how to control the animals, but communication barriers complicated the training. The experiment, therefore, became more than just a logistical project. It became a cultural encounter between American military traditions and Middle Eastern animal handling expertise. The most important field test occurred in 1857 under Lieutenant Edward Fitzgerald Beale. Bill was assigned to survey a wagon road across the Southwest from New Mexico to California. He took 25 camels with him. This expedition offered a genuine test of the animals under frontier conditions. Bill's reports were remarkably positive. The camels traveled long distances without water. They climbed rocky terrain with steady footing. They carried heavy engineering equipment that would have exhausted pack mules. Bill concluded that the animals were extremely well suited for desert transportation. In his words, the experiment had been an entire success. Despite promising results, the camel experiment faced a problem unrelated to performance: politics. By the late 1850s, the United States was moving rapidly towards sectional crisis. Violence in Kansas, bitter arguments over slavery, and the collapse of the Whig Party signaled a nation under strain. The Camel program was closely associated with Jefferson Davis, a Southern political figure. And when Davis left office in 1857, the project lost its strongest supporter. Funding slowed, political enthusiasm faded. Then came the event that would overshadow everything. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. Southern states began seceding, and by early 1861, Texas had joined the Confederacy. Camp Verde, home of the camel herd, fell under Confederate control. The Confederate government had little interest in experimental transportation projects in the Southwest. Its attention was focused on survival. The camels remained at Camp Verde but were rarely used. And when Union forces regained control after the war, the animals were essentially surplus property. In 1866, the United States government auctioned off most of the remaining camels. Some were purchased by private owners, others were used in mining operations. A few were simply released. For years afterward, reports circulated of wild camels just wandering the deserts of Texas and Arizona. I love those reports. The story of the Camel Corps raises an interesting historical question. Did the experiment actually fail? In terms of desert performance, the answer is no. Camels carried heavier loads than mules. They required less water. They traveled long distances across harsh terrain. But successful technology still requires institutional support. The Camel program never achieved full adoption within the Army. It lacked long term funding, training infrastructure, and political backing. The Civil War destroyed the bureaucratic environment that might have allowed the project to expand. In other words, the camels themselves were not the problem, timing was. As random and, quite frankly, as funny as the US Camel Corps experiment is, it also reveals an important truth about innovation. A tool can work perfectly and still fail to be adopted. Technology must align with culture, politics, funding, and historical circumstance. And in the 1850s, Americans believed they could engineer solutions to any geographic challenge. The Camel Corps reflected that optimism. It was bold, it was certainly unusual, and in many ways, it was ahead of its time. But history intervened. The American Civil War consumed the nation before the experiment could mature. Today, the Camel Corps survives mostly as a historical curiosity, a strange footnote in the story of American expansionism. Yet, for a brief moment in the 1850s, it seemed entirely possible that the future of the U.S. Army, in the Southwest at least, might ride not on horseback, but on camelback. This has been the History Podcast. I'm Jason Thomason. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time.